the environment in which we work. So a big thank you for that. From my side, my story is very similar to Fakile's. So for my sins, I've been involved in the compliance environment in phases since around the year 2000. So when there was a piece of legislation that came into effect, POPIA, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, and thereafter phase and FICA. For my sins, I was around, and over time, I've as my love affair, as Fakile said, with compliance grew. It's especially on the side of new legislation that has to be complied with that really energizes me and that I'm passionate about. So over and above my affair and this loving relationship with compliance in general, there is another lover on the block nowadays, and her name is POPIA, the Protection of Personal Information Act. And yeah, our affairs keep us fairly busy. So thank you so much for this platform, Ronnie, and we look forward to discussing some of our experiences further tonight.
Thank you so much, Carlos.
Good evening, everyone. Ronnie, thank you so much for availing this platform to us professionals and to the wider compliance community. As my colleagues have already stated, you know, this is well overdue. If you look at the Auditor General's reports and the findings, if you look at numerous instances of POPI breaches or information breaches that have made the media, and if you look at so many other instances, you know, compliance has never been more relevant. And really, as compliance practitioners, we can no longer just go onto Twitter and go onto LinkedIn and say wise things. You know, we need to act a part, because oftentimes in organizations we're quite senior. Whether you're working inside an organization in a compliance function or outside an organization as an independent compliance practitioner, as we call it, you've got a massive role. You've got access to boards. You've got access to senior management, and really that's the space in which you play. So we really need to take advantage of the power that we have, and we really need to influence organizations the way we can with our knowledge, with our networks, and so on. And look, I don't want to give too much away because I've prepared some slides, and obviously I'll speak to those. But the reason why I believe that you should that you should listen to me is because I've really cut my teeth in compliance way before it's become fashionable. I think these days, you know, everyone's a POPI expert, and you know, everyone's is a compliance person. I think my first experience in compliance was when I was appointed in a freight logistics listed company, and at the time there was no compliance function, there was no compliance officer, there were no systems in place. As a compliance officer myself, I had no systems to rely on, and I really had to make things work. And these days I see people complaining about lack of budgets, and that's the reason why they can't get things done. And I just shake my head, because at the inception of my career, there were no such things in place. You just had to put on your boots and put on your reflector kit and then go onto the field and understand what's going on. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And you know, I'm the director at Gajani Advisory. We specialize in legal and compliance services, and we aim to be the #1 service provider in the entire compliance value chain. So that's me, colleagues, and I'm really looking forward to taking questions from the colleagues on the panel and the wider compliance community as well. Thank you very much, Ronnie.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Stephen. You know, guys, you really inspire me, you know, when I listen to you, what you guys are saying. And especially the fact of, you know, strapping up your own boots and you know, going to make things happen. I think that's what we need more and more in society now. Instead of standing on the sidelines and throwing stones, we should be adding our voice, especially as professionals, because I think the voice of professionals in our society has been very muted up until now. And that's something we aim to change. You know, we need more people to come and share their ideas with us, because, you know, I come from a village, and you know, when you grow up in a village and you go to university, for example, for Carlos, maybe this may be for your benefit. You know, you basically go to university for the whole village, you know, and when whatever happens in that community, if you're around, you have to be part of it because you are at university. So clearly you must know something. And that would include things, Carlos, for example, like with the kettle being lost and all of that. They would say, no, go and call Ronnie, he's from university, they have an idea. So I guess in the same way that we have an African saying that says it takes a village, you know, to raise a child, I guess it takes professionals to build a society. And it's important that we don't abdicate that responsibility at all. We've seen over the past few days, for example, I don't know if you guys saw what was going on at the Zondo Commission with the former company secretary at ESCOM. And many, of course, other incidents of things that we've seen going wrong and so forth. So, but without saying much more, Carlos, I'm going to ask you to please, you know, introduce your topic to us. We'll give you 10 to 15 minutes to deliver your presentation. Whereafter, I'm going to ask Figile to come in, and then Stephen will wrap it up for us. Thereafter, we'll then open up the floor for questions and engagements. Carlos, the floor is yours. Kick off your shoes, and we all ears. Thank you.
Thank you very much, brother. I haven't been wearing shoes for a while with this lockdown. So unfortunately, I'm out of shoes already. But thanks, Ronnie.
Okay.
The purpose of my my input tonight is to share a bit more about applying compliance principles from the highly regulated environment into the not so highly regulated environment. I just want to tell you a little bit more about the organization that I work for. I come from Inlexo. We offer end-to-end legal solutions and transcription services. We are an outsourced in-house advisor. We comprise of a group of highly trained and specialized professionals. From a legal perspective, we're about 20 or so qualified attorneys and advocates, and we have other specialist consultants also working with us. We cover diverse areas of the law. My area of passion, compliance, and then over and above that, we also have a strong commercial practice. We are in the mining sector. We have some deep property skills and similar on the environmental, labor, and health and safety side. Our services are offered on an exclusive basis or by means of an outsourced model. It's important for us to be adaptable according to our clients' requirements. It's important for us to understand our customers' business so that we can really add value. So without further ado, what I would like to touch on tonight is firstly, why compliance? Just a bit of background on that. I'm going to touch on compliance best practice. Then the original discussion that I had with Ronnie about where to start. If we are starting a compliance function within an organization, I think there's very valuable contributions that the other panelists can also provide on that, especially with Stephen's background. And then I'm just going to touch on this topic of POPIA as well. So, well, firstly, it's the first time in my life that my mother is online tonight.
Oh,
so,
wow.
Ronnie, in terms of my village, my village is represented by my mother, and it's a big privilege to even have her as part of the audience tonight. And
welcome, Danny.
For my family.
Thank you so much.
So to link that to what is on the screen, it would be great for me to at some stage ask my mom what she thinks I do. I think it must be something along the lines of that second picture. Unfortunately, I think some of my colleagues, that my co-workers might think it's this picture here on the left-hand bottom side. Most definitely, I know this is what I do here in the middle in the bottom row. And unfortunately, the moment when I move my camera, I think it will be clear that this is what I really do. Ronnie and I shared some time in legal practice, for which I'm very, very thankful. And my principal, this is what my principal's office also looked like. And I think it is something that, unfortunately, it's part of what we do. We have so many irons in the fire, and we're juggling so many balls simultaneously. So yeah, that's just a little bit about what we do. So the term compliance, it is, in terms of certain pieces of legislation, it is prescribed to have a compliance function. So around about the year 2000, there was a specific regulation to the Banks Act, in terms of which it was necessary to have a compliance function. And at that stage, I started cutting my teeth in the compliance environment, acting as a compliance officer within a banking environment. So nowadays, you'll see in terms of specific pieces of legislation that reference is made to compliance. Ronnie referred to financial services during his introduction. I'm sure that the rest of the panelists are going to share with us about their stories tonight and their experiences. Basically, where certain pieces of legislation require us to have a compliance function, it really energizes me to be part of this drive in South Africa and then in the wider community to drive compliance into the not so highly regulated environment. It energizes me to see compliance within industries such as construction and manufacturing and so on, where it's not really a requirement. Compliance is based on international best practice. We'll talk a little bit about that in a while. And then on the screen, as I've just referred to, there are highly regulated industries where there's a legal foundation for a compliance function, but then other not so highly regulated industries where my passion really lies. And then in the public service environment, for instance, with the Public Finance Management Act, the PFMA and the MFMA and so on, which also requires of us to have a compliance drive within an organization. Within each one of the organizations in which our delegates of this session are involved, there are specific requirements that must be complied with. And that will differ from industry to industry and organization to organization, but it's necessary to identify that in your working environment. So in short, it is why it's necessary to comply is it is the law. There is the risk of penalties and fines or imprisonment. But what drives me is it is about good business practice. It's about being a responsible corporate citizen. It brings client satisfaction and client confidence. So there's a huge reputational risk attached if we don't comply. And then just this quote from the former Deputy US Attorney General, it's always something to take into account if we think about the costs of compliance. So in terms of compliance best practice, in our industry, there are some international guidelines or international principles that guide what we do. We are closely aligned to ISO 31000, which speaks to risk management, ISO 19600, which deals specifically with compliance management systems. Now, watch this space, because at the moment, ISO 19600 is being replaced. It's going to be replaced by a more stringent standard, the new ISO 37301. So it's ISO 37301. And for my sins, I'm a presenter on ISO 19600 in South Africa for the PECB international body. And I engaged with PECB earlier this week, and it's clear that ISO 37301 is around the corner, So watch this space. We are going to have a much stronger international ISO standard that govern our industry. But then in the South African context, we are very proud of our generally accepted compliance practice framework, the GACP, and the Southern African Compliance Institute. This version of the GACP, of which I'm showing a picture on the screen now, is a bit aged. The current version of the document looks like this. This is the Bible in the compliance industry. It is about best practice in the South African context. And again, it is based on the highly regulated environment. Further international standards, there's also the COSO framework. And then importantly, in this environment in which Ronnie and his firm are leaders in the governance field, in King 4, there's also strong foundations. Well, it's been like that since the King Code 2, where there's a strong foundation for compliance. So the basis of compliance is real best practice. So where do we start when it's necessary when we're tasked with starting a compliance function within an organization? On the left-hand side, there's a pyramid that I've prepared. Basically, there are certain founding documents, such as here on the right-hand side of the slide. That is about your compliance charter and your compliance policy and the compliance manual. Again, the methodology that I'm referring to now, you can read up on in terms of the generally accepted compliance framework of the Compliance Institute of Southern Africa, and it is based on the best practice principles that we discussed a bit earlier. So it is necessary to firstly have the founding documents in place. Then we determine what we call the regulatory universe by categorizing the regulatory requirements and assessing their seriousness and probability of non-compliance. The regulatory universe is then worked into a compliance risk profile, and we translate that into a compliance plan. And it's very important to entrench a culture of compliance throughout your organization, because compliance is everybody's responsibility. So in terms of what we do at Inlexo, I'm just showing on this slide a quick overview of some of our compliance services. You're very welcome to contact me if you're interested in any of those services. And our experience includes very highly regulated industries such as aviation and the financial services. But then, as we said, also manufacturing and construction and tertiary education, logistics, similar to where our panelist Stephen has also cut his teeth, and then in retail and in agriculture. So yes, compliance has vast impact into different industries. So I quickly want to spend just 3 minutes or so on POPIA, because it's such a hot topic at the moment. Looking at POPIA, so for any delegates that's perhaps not known with that acronym, it refers to the Protection of Personal Information Act, and this is currently very high on our radar. So POPIA is here. In terms of the background of the legislation, the Act has been phased into operation since November 2013, and then very recently, we have all been waiting since the beginning of the year for the commencement date of the bulk of POPIA's requirements, and that was very recently announced by the President, and that was now on the 1st of July of this year. That starts a window period of a year up to end of June next year, in which we need to comply with the legislation. in terms of the services that's currently available in the consulting environment, you are very welcome to Google and have a look at the service providers that are available. I'm aware of it that Mkwanazi, Ronnie's firm, are also POPIA consultants. And what should now typically be done is to identify the areas in your organization that's impacted by this legislation, then to determine the impact on your organization's business processes and systems, to plan what to do by when, so practically allocating responsibilities and target dates. For my sins, when the National Credit Act came into effect, I was involved at the bank as a compliance analyst, and I was responsible. I was one of the team members responsible for driving the readiness initiative in terms of the National Credit Act. And where the tacky hits the tar, it is necessary to plan, to allocate who's going to do what by when in order for us to be compliant. And then it's necessary for us to execute in order to be ready by 30 June next year. So I've included a link here to an article that I've recently written that's available on the Inlexa website. I'll make the slides available afterwards as well, and they can be sent out to the attendees. So the areas of business that's typically impacted by POPIA is listed on this slide. As we mentioned there, from a strategic perspective, who is responsible for compliance with the legislation?
Yes. Sorry to smash your train of thought there. Are you still sharing your screen? Because it looks like you're talking from the slides, but we're not seeing them.
Oh, I see.
Unless if you decided to unshare, Kobus.
We can see them.
Well, no.
Okay, that's fine. All right, thank you.
I can see the slides, sir.
Oh, okay, great. Maybe it's something here. All right, thank you. So
the main topics, just to spur some thought tonight, is have a look at the impact of the legislation from a strategic perspective. It's everybody's responsibility in the organization, and the tone should be set from the top in terms of governance responsibility, in terms of who is driving the process within an organization. Yes, there's a significant information management impact. Then importantly, wherever there's customer interaction. So in terms of our customer relationship management side, wherever we are processing customer information, be on the lookout for the type of personal information that you're collecting and processing, because the Act has a huge impact on that. Similarly, on the human resources side, so employee information that we process. Also in the human resources space, it's going to be very necessary for you to drive training initiatives during the next few months in terms of readiness for the legislation, and then thereafter in terms of implementation. POPIA has a vast impact on marketing, as so two of the examples there is, for instance, where we're used to opting in, where we're used to opting out in terms of the National Credit Act and the Consumer Protection Act. Those text messages that we receive where we can reply stop or out in order to opt out. Going forward, it's going to the playing field is going to change, as we're going to have to opt in for marketing purposes. Then also keep an eye on international transfer of information. POPIA brings restrictions on cross-border transfers of information. The idea with this slide was just to highlight a few areas that's impacted within the organization. I'm going to, Ronnie, my slides have some animation. So I'm going to click through them so that everything shows on the slide. I think there might be a bit of a delay. So on this slide, it shows some concepts just again to spark ideas for the audience, the type of steps that should be taken to mitigate risks. So establish which business processes, docs and systems are impacted in your organization, and then align them with the Act's requirements. Look at when is it necessary to obtain consent. It's going to be necessary to sharpen your pencils in terms of amending policies and documents for the processing of personal information. It's going to be important to look at access rights, who can access what type of information and process it, device security. It's going to be necessary to look at clauses in agreements and perhaps make some adjustments to agreements to include standard clauses. And then very importantly, also training of staff is going to assist us in mitigating the risks. So what we typically do during a gap analysis, our organization have more than 5 years experience doing POPIA readiness exercises in various industries. It is necessary to do a organization-wide analysis of the state of processing of your personal information. As we said a bit earlier, identify the areas affected within the business, and then physically identify representatives per area. And then from a project governance perspective, we utilize them on a project board or a steering committee of sorts, who is then responsible for driving this process. This next slide just shows what a readiness exercise, a gap analysis would typically look like, what one would do within the organization. Again, the idea is just to spark some thoughts with tonight's attendees in terms of the measures that they can take in order to be ready by the 30th of June next year. Then importantly, some lessons that we've learned, what not to do. Early on, establish whose project is this, who is responsible for driving the POPIA initiative in your organization. Is it IT? Is it compliance? Is it legal? As we said a bit earlier, compliance is everybody's responsibility. So sort out the ownership and have the executive buy-in to drive that process. While you are looking at your POPIA compliance, it's important to look at the other side of the coin in terms of your PIA policies, your PIA manual, the processes that you follow in terms of the Promotion of Access to Information Act as well. It's important to remember that POPIA is wider than just the 8 conditions. Also take into account the special conditions for processing of personal information, and remember about the international transfer of information. Another important lesson that we've learned in the not so highly regulated environment is we are all used to having asset registers in our organization. Look at the importance of an information asset register as a potential delivery mechanism for your readiness exercise. So in closure, thank you very much for the opportunity tonight. I look forward to engaging further with the other panelists and with our attendees tonight. You're very welcome to contact me afterwards as well to engage further in conversation. And yes, my contact particulars will also be shared when the slides of tonight are shared with the attendees. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos, for such an insightful presentation. And I'm sure the guests are already yearning to hear more in terms of when we get to question time. But I want to keep the flow going so that, we don't get, lose our momentum. So I'm going to ask Fikile just to, introduce her topic and tell us, and do a presentation as well. Fikile? Fikile, you're muted. You're still muted, Fikile.
Sorry,
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
That's fine, thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I had to discipline my kids because they were making noise, and I had to let them know that this is big business, so they must go to their bedrooms.
We must integrate, Fikile.
Yeah. Okay, so my opening remarks will mostly be based on the financial services industry. In terms of the compliance they're in. This is a highly regulated industry, just like Carlos has indicated. Regulatory requirements in this space are a real big deal because they have a huge impact on the company. The consequences of non-compliance with them are dire for companies. I mean, just like Carlos has mentioned, you have potential loss of license, you've got jail term, for officials, you have big fines coming out, which we've seen. There's also a reputational risk element to it. So, yeah, that is why it's a big deal, to have compliance officers in this industry. And that is why most of these companies find themselves shutting down. I think we've seen some of the companies recently that have shut down due to non-compliances or due to control failures. It's because this is a highly regulated industry. And not only that, the regulations that come out in this industry are huge. I mean, we've got acts here that are anything from 150 pages to 600 pages, in size, which is all very overwhelming, for the company and for their officers. So yes, there is a lot at stake. There are also, there's increased sanctions. Not only is there a lot of regulations, there's also a lot of regulatory sanctions. And really the increase that we are seeing currently in regulation in this industry is because of the very same, control breakdowns, corporate failures, scandals like, Steinhoff, which is the most recent example. That is why there's so much regulation in this industry. And that is why there's a lot more focus on consequences of non-compliance. That's why you see, directors being sent to jail for non-compliance or, skipping the country to avoid, jail. So there are also a lot of new technologies coming out in this industry. There's a lot of new products, there's new services, and all of this necessitates, more regulation in this industry. So brace yourselves, there's more to come. If you think we are over-regulated now in this industry, we are going to be even more regulated in the very near future. So I would like to focus, on some of the trends that we are seeing as fixed legal and compliance in this financial services space. The first trend is that some of the big players in this industry are now moving towards outsourcing their compliance functions or co-sourcing their compliance functions, where they outsource some part of their compliance function, or they outsource a certain project, like Carlos has mentioned, the implementation of POPIA. We have a lot of clients at the moment where we are helping them implement that, where, for example, companies would also outsource a certain deliverable. If they have, for example, a compliance plan, which Carlos has alluded to, and they are realizing that they are not going to achieve the items that are on their compliance plan, they usually call us in and we complete that compliance plan for them. So we supplement the resources that companies have at times. And one of the biggest, results, or one of the biggest gains in outsourcing a compliance function is that it doesn't hurt your bottom line as much. You have reduced cost because these people are not full-time employees. These people are highly skilled individuals that come in at a low cost, where you don't have to pay things like company benefits, in order to bring these resources in-house. They can upskill your current compliance resources in terms of, providing supervision while providing the consulting services, supervising your current compliance resources or your internal compliance officers, things like skills transfer. And that's mostly what we are finding more and more our clients, prefer from us, which is something we introduced a while back, where we work with in-house compliance officers, and by the time we leave the company, we have transferred skills, and we leave better skilled compliance officers in the business. Same for governance personnel, same for legal risk managers. This is really what we do. Because there is a lot of regulatory instruments in this industry that are being introduced on a daily basis. And there's a shortage of compliance skills currently in this industry. So that is why there's a need for compliance consultants, and that is why it's important as well for us compliance consultants to make sure that we upskill the compliance personnel that is in these companies. So this is really why we at Fix Legal and Compliance exist. We provide those expert resources for companies. We bring our expertise to the company. We ensure that fundamental areas of legal and governance and compliance risk management are expertly, run, and we make sure that resources that are in companies that are tasked with compliance are upskilled or better skilled, and we provide things like coaching, mentoring, assessing, and so on. So, like I said, there is an impact on the balance sheet of a company in terms of complying with legislation as well. We know that most companies find compliance to be a burden, but we beg to differ. And this is another trend that we have seen. We have seen another trend that in financial services industry, compliance has become one of the key strategic pillars of business, because companies know now that there is increased value to their balance sheet if they comply with legislation. We are seeing more and more less, companies that are fully compliant incurring less fine, less stringent regulatory oversight, and so on. There's a paper that was issued by a company called Cisco. They issued a report that says, for every $1 that you spend on compliance as a company, you stand to have a return on investment of $2 or more. So there's really a trend that we are seeing where companies are looking at compliance as a strategic exercise, So another trend that we've picked up so far is that we are seeing more principles-based regulation coming out in the financial services industry versus what we had in the past, which was rules-based legislation. Rules-based legislation basically tells you this is what you must comply with, and this is how you must comply with it. Whereas principles-based legislation tells you this is what you must comply with, and it's up to you to decide, to determine how to comply with it. Again, this is an area that requires a lot of expertise in terms of implementing those principles and those outcomes that come out of this legislation. Carlos mentioned POPIA. POPIA is a principles-based legislation, and companies have to be creative and innovative in how they comply with that act. And that is why expertise experts like us are required to come into the business and, coach the business and guide the business on how to actually comply with that piece of legislation, because the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work when it comes to those kind of instruments. And this is what regulators have also realized, and that's why they've that principle-based legislation. That's why when you look at legislation lately, you will see things like compliance must be structured in a way that is aligned to the nature of the business, the size of the business, the complexity of the business. And that is exactly what we focus on when we service our clients. We do not use a one-size-fits-all approach. So it's really critical that we as compliance officers go out there and lend our expertise to companies and help them structure policies, processes, systems, controls in a way that they achieve outcomes that will make a difference to their balance sheet, a good difference to their balance sheet. And we don't hurt the balance sheet in the way that we run, our various compliance functions. So in this trend, in terms of principles-based versus rules-based regulation, I mean, there's some new pieces that we are seeing that are coming in that are indicative of this trend. Currently, we are in the middle of the implementation of POPIA, which is principles-based. We have the new Twin Peaks model of regulation in financial services, whereby we have one regulator that focuses on the financial soundness of companies, and another regulator that focuses on the conduct of business of companies. And out of this Twin Peaks model of regulation as well, we have the Financial Sector Regulation Act, which empowers these two regulators. The two regulators are the Prudential Authority and the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. And you will see as these authorities also find their feet, they are also issuing regulation that is mostly principles-based or outcomes-based. We have the Insurance Act, which deals with what type of licenses insurance companies can obtain, classes of insurance business, subclasses, and so on. Then we have, the Prudential Authority as well, issuing prudential standards, standards for solvency requirements for insurers. We've got Basel III. Most of these regulations are principles-based. We have conduct standards for banks that have been recently issued by the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. We have a lot of conduct standards coming out on a daily basis at the moment, almost on a daily basis anyway. And in a nutshell, these regulations are more about companies demonstrating how their culture, enables compliance, and how their culture ensures fair outcomes for their customers, and what governance and oversight mechanisms are in place to ensure compliance. And those governance and oversight mechanisms are designed by us compliance officers. So we're really seeing a shift in the way that regulators are bringing out regulation or are drafting regulation at the moment. We also have things like the FICA Amendment Act. That's really a principles-based, outcomes-based piece of legislation. We've seen amendments to the phase fit and proper requirements, which, interestingly, also include requirements for automated advice, robo-advice, so to speak. So we can see that regulators are really catching up with the international trends. We've got in the financial market space, in investments, we have amendments to the Financial Markets Act. We have in the payment space, we've got recent amendments to the National Payment Systems Act. We have regulation in the horizon for fintech. Regulators are trying to find a way to regulate cryptocurrencies, for example. And really we're seeing that the trend is moving, and compliance officers need to catch up with these trends. Even regulators are using more technology in their supervision and enforcement of regulation. That's why we have things like RegTech. Companies are also doing the same. Companies are using InsurTech, for example, in the insurance space, fintech in the broader financial services space. So we as compliance officers, and this talks again to the main topic of the day, which is compliance into the future. As compliance officers, we need to catch up, with what the trends we are seeing are. And we need to catch up with this fourth industrial revolution and digitize, as much as we can the services that we offer. You know, some people think that the compliance function might be extinct or redundant in the near future. I disagree. Somebody needs to build the algorithms for these machines. Somebody needs to tell the machine how to operate. Somebody needs to manage the machine. Somebody needs to tell the machine which report to pull up, what monitor, you know, and all of those things. So as compliance officers, I think it's about time that we catch up with the trends that we are seeing. I mean, there's things like monitoring software. The time has gone now for compliance officers to go into companies and sit with papers and, you know, take 10 files in front of their desks and monitor hard copies. Machines are here, and we need to embrace that. So that's another trend that we've picked up, which is highly technological activities happening in the space. So really, like, let me summarize. The first trend is that we are moving towards outsourcing or co-sourcing in terms of the financial services industry. The second trend is that rules or regulations are becoming more principles-based versus rules-based, which is why we need expertise in order to design processes to comply with those principles, or to show, to demonstrate. It's all about demonstrate compliance with those principles-based legislation. And then the third trend is, you know, there's a lot of technology coming out, and customers of compliance officers no longer expect compliance officers to be using pen and paper. I like the photo that Carlos showed, which shows him sinking under a lot of paper. I read somewhere that compliance officers and, you know, legal managers spend about 20 hours a day reading legislation. I don't have 20 hours in a day. So we need to find better ways to actually read legislation, understand, you know, interpret it for our clients, and really render our services. So that's the third trend that we are seeing, which is highly digitized industry. So we at Fix Legal and Compliance are also on a digitization journey. I mean, we are trying to develop an app right now for our clients. We are trying to, you know, procure some of the software that we need in order to service our clients better. You know, clients also don't want to sit in an office with a compliance officer, you know, to answer a simple question. We need to find a way to answer questions quickly and on demand by our clients, you know. So really, because we're in an era of principles-based legislation, we really need experts in this industry. So that is why really Fix Legal and Compliance exists, because there is a shortage in the industry, and there is a shortage of skills as well in the compliance space, in the legal space, and in the governance space. I know there's a lot of attorneys in South Africa, but most attorneys cannot be compliance officers, or are not compliance officers, are unable to render compliance services. So there is a shortage, but we are able to take on clients. So just give us a call. Our website is www.fixlc.co.za. We are here to help you. I hope, Ronnie, you give me a chance, you know, at the end of this presentation to share our contact details, or maybe our contact details can be found on the Legal Webinars website.
Yes,
you know.
okay. All right.
Okay, so that's really what I am all about, and that's what Fix Legal and Compliance is all about. And that is an overview of what's happening in financial services right now. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, thank you so much, Fikile. That to me was really mind blowing. You know, obviously not being from the financial services industry. And you also raised a very important point about, you know, I would say digital compliance, I suppose, you know, moving forward. You spoke about the robotics and
exactly.
And if you had to throw in all other things, you throw in blockchain and all those,
yes.
you know, dilemmas that come. So usually when we talk about this issue, especially about robotics, there's a very important, you know, scene that comes to my mind. And I don't know, for those of you who have watched the movie I, Robot, there's a scene, I think, in the beginning of the movie where a car crashes into a river, or, you know, and these police robots are going to assist, you know, the victims of the car crash. But when it gets into the car, it has to make a quick calculation because there's a policeman who needs to be saved and there's a little child who also needs to be saved. But the compliance system of the robot says to him, he must save the policeman because he's more valuable to society, etc., etc. And as a consequence, the kid then passed on, you know? So those kind of frameworks, in terms of, you know, where ethical and moral dilemmas arise, which will happen more and more as we become more digital and so forth, are going to need compliance practitioners, as you say, and legal experts and policy experts to sit together to craft the frameworks to say, these are the considerations. Because can you imagine, in the example I just given, if you're having a driverless car, driving on the M1, and the next thing it's supposed to have a collision, you have to choose whether you must collide with a dog or hit a human being. And those calculations will have to be made by this machine in a split second of a time. So it's really interesting times, and I'm glad you're saying this because you're right. Most people think it's a closed industry. There isn't a lot of opportunities, but I'm glad the perspective you brought from it for people to actually, broaden their horizons even more and look into the future in terms of taking, you're basically saying we're taking compliance off digital. And that's where the future lies. And basically all the skills that we need to develop going forward, if we are going to be compliance practitioners, should have elements of the digital that you referred to. But thank you so much for that.
Correct. Just before I sign off, Ronnie, you've raised an important point about, you know, the movie example that you've made about that robot that was built to recognize the man as or the father in this accident as the person that he's supposed to save, or that this robot is supposed to save. You know, I read recently about a robot that was developed in a financial services company. And this robot was developed to help with recruitment exercises. And this robot recognized male applicants more than female applicants, you know, in shortlisting candidates for recruitment. And surely that's not what that robot was supposed to do. So somebody must be behind these robots to design them or to build the algorithms to make sure that they achieve the purpose for which this robot is being procured. You know, things like you've just mentioned now, skills development. This is a critical thing for us at Fixed Legal and Compliance. We always have interns. And the thing for me is that it might be too late at the time that I get an intern who is a legal or an LLB graduate or a BCom graduate to come into compliance. We need to maybe push for compliance to also be, you know, showcased in the universities, you know, so that we have better skilled compliance officers, you know, have a module in the LLB or have a module in the BCom degree that deals with compliance, risk management. And by doing that, we'll ensure that there is not the skills shortage that we're seeing now in compliance.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Fikile, for that. You've just fired me up even more. So as Gache and Stephen, the platform is now yours, sir. Introduce your topic and take us on your journey. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Ronnie. Thank you, Fikile, and thank you to my other colleague, Karis. You know, I've learned so much from compliance officers, and you know, every time I engage with other compliance professionals in the industry, there's so much that's there to be learned, and there's so much wisdom that compliance officers have, because obviously they've got different experiences. As I'll put forward now, I've also got different experiences. So it's really humbling to hear those lessons, and thank you so much to my colleagues. So my topic is the independent compliance reviews, and I'm quite passionate about this subject because it's something that's not really well understood, and it's something that's mystified for no reason. But before I get there, I think it's also quite important that I introduce an element of storytelling, and I'll tell you what my compliance background is, because I really believe that in the compliance industry, psyche is everything. Your mentality is everything. Your approach to things is everything. The experiences that you come with when you're advising different clients and you engaging different colleagues in the industry, it's everything. So it's really important for us to inquire about, so where did you start compliance, and how were you introduced to it, and were there any modules available for you to go and read, and so that you could further your knowledge on compliance and so on. So I started my compliance journey in a listed freight logistics company, as I just mentioned. And I had quite a daunting task, because it was made very clear to me upon my appointment that what you need to do is establish a compliance function, which was not there at the time. And I needed to embed a compliance culture. So there's two things that I really needed to do. I needed to embed a culture of compliance, and I needed to establish a compliance function. So these were very daunting tasks. And unfortunately for me at the time, that organization didn't have a compliance function. There were no policies in place. There were no systems in place. And really, from a compliance perspective, the organization wasn't that well prepared and wasn't well considered towards compliance. Compliance wasn't something that they considered to be important. It wasn't a priority. It was a company that really focused on profit making, the bottom line, and pleasing shareholders, if I can put it that way. So, the most important lesson that I learned from having to develop a compliance function, a compliance culture, the two most important things I learned were resilience and building strong business or working relationships with the people within the organization. And I just want to spend more time on the issue of a compliance culture. We're talking about policies, we're talking about systems, and so on and so forth. But if the organization doesn't have a compliance culture, from a compliance perspective, you're in deep trouble. We've seen it in many organizations where the systems are there. The legal department is there. There's a compliance function. Everything's there, but the one thing that's lacking is the compliance culture. And because the compliance culture is not there, the policies have no traction. The systems, they have no traction, because a system basically gives you access to information. And then it's up to you as a compliance officer, as a legal professional, as a management team, as a board, to look at that information and either act on it or don't act on it. And how you act on information that's provided by a system is entirely dependent on how strong the compliance culture is within the organization. And then I also touched on the issue of building strong working relationships within an organization. To everyone on this call, I'll put it to you that it's impossible to be effective in compliance if you don't have the ability to build business or working relationships with your colleagues. Because let's face it, in an organization, any organization, a big organization, medium-sized, a small organization, the organization is there to make profits. And compliance is not something that someone with an MBA has been taught. Many people just have not been taught compliance. So when you start with your compliance program and you're trying to roll the compliance program out into the organization, you can't just expect that everyone's going to welcome you with open arms and embrace you. And here's our champion. Finally, we've got a person who's talking about compliance. Yes, let's go. The reality of it is going to be resistance. And when there's resistance, you cannot afford to lose your temper and to go on social media and complain about the fact that you're not getting sufficient support in the organization. No, you need to build the relationships. And how you build the relationships is you start by storytelling. You start by telling your colleagues within the organization, why do you do what you do? Why is it important to have a compliance function? Why is it important to comply? My colleague Kadas said something brilliant and very true in practice, that compliance is not about avoiding fines and the normal lines that we often exposed to, but compliance is about best business practices. And being a responsible corporate citizen. And we're living in a day and age where society frowns on organizations that are found to be non-compliant, on organizations that seem to not have a good compliance culture. We've seen that in the media, and I don't think there's much convincing to be done in that regard. So in summary, my experience of embedding a compliance function in a compliance culture was that you need to be resilient and you need to build strong relationships. And if you can base your compliance efforts on the culture and the relationships, I think that your compliance initiatives will be sustainable. And even when you're not there in the organization, the compliance function will be able to continue as it was intended to. So at some stage in my career, I did a bit of a segue when I left corporate, and I decided to start an advisory firm called Gajeni Advisory, which is where I am now. And the sole purpose of Gajeni Advisory at the time and now is to assist companies in becoming responsible corporate citizens and being the best organizations that they can become through good corporate governance and good compliance and upskilling organizations in those fields. I think that's very important. And that justifies our existence, and it justifies my existence as well. And then I think it's important to mention that, especially on the issue of education and upskilling oneself, at some stage I acquired a independent compliance practitioner certificate. So I'm a certified compliance practitioner. And the reason I went about that route is because I was made aware that the Compliance Institute does offer such a professional designation. And so I applied and I wrote the board exam and I was successful, and I now have the designation. So I think it's very important for any compliance practitioner or compliance officer to continuously develop themselves. You need to look at what courses are available for you, and you need to go and do those courses. For example, the Compliance Institute, and either becoming a certified compliance practitioner, and then after that becoming a certified compliance professional. I think that's very important because it also helps you gain perspective into best compliance practices. So I just want to share with you as well some of my experiences with regards to independent compliance reviews. I think this is where I join the dots between my story and my background and my practical experience. So just during the lockdown, I assisted the South African National Space Agency with a independent gap analysis. So that exercise lasted about 4 months. And really the scope of works there was that the South African National Space Agency, in its RFQ, specified which laws it wanted an independent compliance practitioner to come and test, and to test the organization's compliance with those laws. For example, there was the Protection of Personal Information Act. There was some legislation that's really specific to the space agency world, such as the Special Digitization Information Act. There was also the National Key Point Act, which was obviously part of the scope of works and very important, the piece of legislation, old and also not really well understood. And then there was the PFMA, COIDA, Occupational Health and Safety Acts, and so on. And the experience was very sobering. At the end of the gap analysis, we presented, I think it was an 80-page report to the board. And hear me when I say, that 80-page report, it wasn't 80 pages because we wanted to be academic and we wanted to sound clever, but we were articulating issues that we had come across. And the board was very encouraged to have this feedback. And according to the board, this exercise was very sobering. So what I've experienced when doing independent compliance reviews is that initially an organization thinks that, of course, they're compliant because they've got a legal person somewhere in the organization. So they should be compliant with all the laws that apply to them. Or, of course, we're compliant. We're such a small organization and we work really hard, so there's no reason why we shouldn't be compliant. So when you actually table the reports, you empower senior management and you empower the board to say, look, these are the issues that you have from a compliance perspective. These are the control gaps that you have, and these control gaps are causing these instances of non-compliance. So in order to address these instances of non-compliance, these are some of the recommendations that we are putting to you. Maybe you need to have certain controls in place to deal with the Protection of Personal Information Act. And as you all know, controls can come in the way of policies, in the way of frameworks, and so on. There's different kinds of controls. So you'd obviously have to apply your mind as to which is the most relevant control to the problem at hand. We've also done independent compliance reviews for INSETA, the Insurance Sector Training Authority. We did an independent compliance review for the City of Johannesburg, the Johannesburg Development Agency. We did POPIA implementation exercises for a company in the sport bet industry. And this was about 2 years ago. So it was way before the 1 July effective date of POPIA. We assisted the organization to start implementing POPIA then, so that by the time POPIA became effective and by the time the grace period elapsed, they should have been materially compliant with POPIA. And they could just spend that 1 year grace period fixing certain things and amending policies and so on. That was an illuminating experience, a very enjoyable experience. We've also done some independent compliance review for the Government Employee Pension Fund. So that's why, in a nutshell, this topic is really interesting to me, and it resonates with me. So I just wanted to clarify as well, while we speak on the issue of independent compliance reviews, this is it's not a subject that should be mystified. And the reason why I say that is, Curtis, my colleague, has already pointed out that a lot of the compliance issues that we come across these days are already embedded in legislation. For example, an independent compliance review is already embedded in King 4. If you go to Principle 13 and you go to Recommended Practice 22, it says there that an independent review or assurance exercise is recommended. So really what that's saying is that a board of an organization should from time to time consider the need to either instruct the internal audit function to do an independent compliance review, or instruct an independent compliance practitioner or independent compliance firm to come and do that independent compliance review. All right, so, and another example is the Generally Accepted Compliance Practice Framework of 2018. Again, it speaks about independent reviews, and it sets out recommended practices and relevant standards. And I'll tell you that as an independent compliance practitioner, we've always sought to apply those principles, and we found that those principles are very useful to compliance practice. So the framework itself, the Generally Accepted Compliance Practice Framework, it's something that every compliance officer should spend a lot of time working on, and it's very useful to ensure effective independent compliance reviews. And we also need to spend time understanding, but what's the purpose of an independent compliance review? And the purpose of an independent compliance review is to get assurance that the management approach to compliance is operating as intended. And I think that's where many organizations tend to not spend enough time trying to understand the importance of understanding. You might have a compliance function, or you might have a compliance officer, but the question is that compliance function operating as intended by management? In other words, is it effective? And you'll determine whether or not it's effective by doing a full independent compliance review. So you'll test compliance with legislation, PFMA, Protection of Personal Information, COIDA, et cetera. You'll test controls. Are the controls doing the work that they're supposed to do? The Auditor General has spoken to us about all the control failures within municipalities that are resulting in fruitless and wasteful expenditure and so on. So the issue of controls, it's a real issue, and it's an issue that can be resolved by understanding what is the deficiency in the control and what can be done to improve that control, or should that control be removed completely and replaced with a new control? Those are some of the discussions that are had in terms of independent compliance reviews. And again, the full steps of an independent compliance review are articulated in the Generally Accepted Compliance Practice Framework. I also just wanted to spend a little bit of time on some of the comments that come from boards when we complete independent compliance reviews. Like I mentioned earlier, boards will say, that's interesting. We thought that the Protection of Personal Information Act, an act of 2013, by now surely it's 2020, of course we're complying with that. And then when you take them through the gaps, then they realize that, okay, no, we're not complying with this legislation. We need to put more resources and we need to put more effort into complying with that legislation. And many boards are simply not aware that there's something called an independent compliance review. And many boards, interestingly, confuse or can't make the distinction between a compliance officer and a legal practitioner, or a compliance practitioner and a legal practitioner. My colleague Figile mentioned earlier on in her presentation that a legal practitioner is not necessarily a compliance practitioner. There's, for example, there's the compliance practitioner designation that you would have to get to be a compliance practitioner. So being admitted as an attorney at the High Court doesn't automatically qualify you as a certified compliance practitioner. So that's something to remember as well, that there's a distinction between the two disciplines. I just also want to spend a little bit of time unpacking the practical implementation of an independent compliance review. In other words, what does an independent compliance review entail? So in our experience, usually the message comes from the board to say, the board asks management, how far are we with our compliance obligations? In other words, what is our status when it comes to compliance? Are we red? Are we green? Are we orange? Is there a bit of orange and a bit of green? What's our status? They want to know that. And then from that point, management will either make a decision to draw up an RFQ and publish it to the public, and there'll be a scope of works to say, for example, this is our organization, this is our industry, these are the laws that apply to us. Please submit an RFQ, and if you are successful, you can come and test whether we comply with the laws that we say apply to us. So that's usually where everything starts. And then if you're appointed as the preferred bidder and you do the independent compliance review, the first step would be to go to the organization. You have what you call an initial meeting. And in that initial meeting, there'll be an exchange of documents and information. You might want to clarify the scope of works. And then from there, that's the difficult part, where you'll actually go back to the Generally Accepted Compliance Practice Framework and you'll apply the whole compliance process. So those of you who are familiar with the Generally Accepted Compliance Practice Framework, there's a whole compliance process. And the first phase is the compliance risk identification. That's where you identify all the legislation and the specific compliance obligations that that organization would have in terms of that legislation. Remember, when you look at organizations, legislation applies differently to every organization, in a sense that if you look at POPIA, for example, if you're a marketing agency and you're a freight logistics company, you'll have a different interaction with the Protection of Personal Information Act. For example, a marketing agency will do a lot of marketing, so they'll need to they'll need to spend a lot of time on, for example, Section 69 of Protection of Personal Information Act, whereas a freight logistics company might not be doing that much of direct marketing. They might have other forms of marketing, especially from my experience. And then the phase 2 is the compliance risk assessment. Again, my colleague Figile spoke about the raft or the sea of legislation and the regulations that are popping up almost every month. So there's a need to do a compliance risk assessment so that you can prioritize a compliance obligation. because not every compliance obligation is material to your organization. That's a fact. Some compliance obligations are material and some are not. And if an organization and a compliance officer focus on the material compliance obligation, then that reduces the time wasted on compliance obligations that are not important to the organization. So that principle of prioritization, I can't stress the importance of it. And then there's phase 3, which is the compliance risk management, which is something that's continuous and ongoing. You need to continuously do it. You don't just draw up a compliance risk management plan and leave it in a drawer. That needs to be a document. That needs to be a living document that the compliance officer and the compliance function apply on a daily basis. And then obviously there's phase 4, which is the compliance risk monitoring. And again, the compliance risk monitoring is ongoing. It's something that must happen every day by management, the compliance function, and the compliance officer. So those are some of the deep practical aspects of independent compliance reviews. And I must also stress that one of the most important skills for a compliance officer or a compliance practitioner when you're doing an independent compliance review is you need to use your human instincts. What do I mean by that? Sometimes you'll come across information and that information is saying to you, there's further questions that you need to ask. So some compliance officers will look at that information. They might see that there's further questions to be asked, but they might choose not to. So an effective compliance practitioner or officer will ask those further questions, will go the extra mile, will spend more time with businesses to understand the business model and to understand, therefore, how the laws apply to that industry and that business model. And generally speaking, that compliance officer or compliance practitioner will get more out of independent compliance review. Why? Because you're more curious and you ask more questions and you probe more. And really, those are some of the skills that legislation doesn't really speak about. The generally accepted compliance practice framework, it does speak about those things, but perhaps not. It perhaps doesn't go far enough. So we all need to realize that you've got to go further. You've got to probe, and you've got to be curious. Always be curious. Another myth that I would like to debunk, and some of my colleagues touched on the issue, that perhaps there's a perception that independent compliance reviews are perhaps a luxury and perhaps the organization can take that money and go spend it somewhere else. There's legislation that requires you to do independent compliance reviews. If you're a listed company, you're bound by King 4, and King 4 tells you to do independent compliance reviews. And if you do an independent compliance review, then at least senior management and the board can be kept abreast of developments of a compliance nature. They can be kept abreast of non-compliances. They can be kept abreast on what work has been done to plug those instances of non-compliance. So it's definitely not a waste of time to do independent compliance reviews. It's not a luxury, and it's something that every organization, regardless of size, should do at some stage and should do as often as possible. All in all, as I said at the beginning, if you're a compliance officer or a compliance practitioner, there's lots of work for you to do. It's a difficult industry. There's a lot of work to be done, and I hold a slightly different view regarding technology. I don't think technology yet has all the answers for the compliance industry. For example, there's plenty of software that relates to the Protection of Personal Information Act, but I have my reservations on whether that software can make you comply. For example, how would that software do a personal impact assessment as required in terms of Regulation 4 of POPIA? Because really a personal information assessment requires for an organization to understand exactly which departments do we have, in those departments, what information flows through those departments, And at the end, what happens with that information? So it's really an exercise that requires management and compliance officers to get their hands dirty. It's an exercise that requires empirical evidence. And I really don't think that technology has quite got the answers yet, although maybe in the future it might have answers. So that's my take on independent compliance reviews, compliance and technology. And I would love to take questions from the crowd, from Ronnie, and from my colleagues as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. That was very, very insightful. Thank you for that. Once again, we've actually reached the end of our webinar, and I wouldn't want to overburden our guests with any more time. As you know, this is supposed to be family time, and that's why we're so thankful for you guys for making it again. So what I'm going to ask is that I'm going to ask them to, some of them have already given their details. I suggest that if you have anything to, unless if you just want to do one question each, colleagues, do you think you can indulge us for that? You know, it's just one question each before we go, and then we can take it from there. Maybe let me start. I'm going to ask for indulgence just for 5 minutes, colleagues. I see Figile's details are already there. Karas, you can put yours up as well as yourself, Kajeni, in the meantime whilst we finish this off. But
sure.
The first question that comes to me, is there sufficient consequence management for non-compliance in our country? Because, you know, one of you said that, you know, most of the time, all those compliance, you know, systems or, you know, policies and frameworks and the laws, the legislation and everything, all of that is in place. But that compliance culture, does it allow for consequence management? And maybe that will be a question that I'll give to each one of you to give a response to, then we'll close our session. Let me start with you, Karos. Is there sufficient consequence management to encourage compliance in South Africa?
Ronnie, thank you so much for such an easy question that can just be answered by just skimming over the surface.
Yeah.
Ronnie, that question talks directly to the heart. I think I'm only in a position where I can talk for myself. From a philosophical perspective, I dream of a community, of a country where there's principle-based compliance, like Fikile has said. I think it's a very important factor that Fikile alluded to. I dream of a community and a country where we live compliance from a culture perspective, the way that Stephen alluded to. Those are my dreams. Unfortunately, that's not the way that we experience it every day. I dream of a community where being a responsible corporate citizen will be enough of a drive to ensure compliance. I dream of a stronger carrot than a stick. I wish that it's possible that the carrot in the relationship, drawing us towards compliance, and the value that will add to our community will be enough to cause us to comply. But like I said when I started with my answer, Ronnie, that's a question that cuts deep to the bone, and unfortunately these philosophical dreams are not necessarily the current reality in the world.
Yeah, Figile, consequence management, what's your view? Do we have enough? Can we beef it up? Because I don't think we lack frameworks and laws and all of that. I think that is there. So where's the issue? Yeah.
I think laws are absolutely there. I think in the past, they haven't been enforced in a way that, you know, shows serious consequences for non-compliance. I think regulators have been very lenient, I must say. I think boards have been very lenient, and I think I see somewhere in some parts we are moving in the right direction, but we are far from it at this point. So the answer to that question is no. Hopefully we'll get there in the near future. We are on track. I mean, we are on our way there, but we're definitely not there.
Okay, Stephen?
Thank you, Ronnie. I think we're definitely not there, and we've got a long, long way to go. There's just not enough consequence management, simply put.
Okay. All right, thanks. Look, look, colleagues, I don't want to open up this floor now because I know we're out of time. And if I give one person a chance to ask a question, then I'm going to have to give everyone a chance. So can I suggest that we leave it there for today? Thank you very much. You have our speakers' details in the chat boxes there. You can just check those ones out. And if you have further questions, email us, email the speakers. Let's keep the communication going. Thank you so much, colleagues, for your time. And until we meet again in due course, good luck in all your endeavors and in all your, goals and so forth that you're doing. So thank you very much. We truly appreciate your time. Our panelists, thank you. Media Fella, thank you very much for putting the webinar together for us again today. And to all of you colleagues who attended, thank you for your time. Until we meet again next time. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you
very much, Ronnie. Goodbye.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Cheers. Goodbye.
Cheers.